Mr. Hayes, experience is good, but it cannot compare to a real education.
I will step aside, just don't ruin anything important in the first 5 minutes.
Move aside. Mr. Hayes, this system practically runs itself. That was the first thing I heard as I stepped into the control room. Not a greeting, not a question, just a command delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never once stood in front of a turbine spinning at full load for a split second. I thought he was joking. Then I saw the kid. Chad Whitmore, 27, Harvard MBA, already standing in the center of the room like he was auditioning for the role of boy genius. He held a tablet in one hand backward, naturally, and pointed at the grid interface with the other as if he'd invented electricity 5 minutes ago. Energy grids aren't complicated. Mr. Hayes, he announced loudly, clearly proud of himself. It's all algorithms now. If you're listening right now, tell me, where are you watching from? I love seeing people from every corner of the world join these stories. And it's funny, in a painful way, that about 95% of you are listening without subscribing. So if you enjoy a good workplace disaster, especially when I'm the one walking straight into it, go ahead and tap subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. I stared at the upside-down tablet, then at the faces of the engineers who had worked beside me for decades. Not one of them spoke. Their silence pressed against the air, heavy and embarrassed, the way people freeze before saying goodbye to someone being pushed out the door. They remembered the turbine collapse of 2009. They remembered who climbed the tower in the storm, and they remembered who didn't. But today, none of that mattered. Chad flashed me a smile so bright it could have powered half the county. The board wants modernization, he said. Fresh thinking. A new direction. New direction. That was a polite way of saying, step aside, old man. I felt the humiliation settle, not loud, not dramatic, just cold, clean, precise. The kind of cold that cuts deeper the quieter it is. Before I could respond, Andrea from HR slipped in beside me, holding a cardboard box like she was delivering a folded flag. Connor, she murmured, don't stress about the inspection this afternoon. It's just routine. Routine. I almost laughed, because I knew exactly what today was the FERC-NERC Joint Reliability Audit, the federal inspection capable of shutting a company down in 24 hours, and the kid holding the tablet upside down was about to represent us. I wish I could say Chad's performance in the control room surprised me, but betrayal rarely arrives with fireworks. It comes quietly, the way a cold draft slips under a door. After 27 years in this company, I should have been immune to disappointment, yet watching him wave that upside-down tablet reopened something I thought had healed. His confidence wasn't the wound. The board's belief that he could replace me without consequence was what actually hurt. Back in 1998, I wasn't anyone worth replacing. I was a 28-year-old technician climbing turbine towers in weather that made smarter men stay home. I learned every bolt, every vibration pattern, every sound a turbine made when it was tired. Those early years carved discipline into me. I didn't have a degree from anywhere fancy, just bruised knuckles and an instinct for knowing when a machine was whispering that something was wrong. By the mid-2000s, I had moved into vibration monitoring, the kind of work no one notices unless it fails. I spent nights listening to turbines hum like restless animals, predicting failures before they happened. Promotions never mattered to me. Preventing disasters did. That focus eventually led me into the risk director seat, overseeing every inch of this network. It wasn't power I cared about, just the knowledge that thousands of homes stayed lit because I paid attention. But 2009 changed me in ways the board never bothered to understand. Michael Ortiz, my closest friend on the field team, died when a failing turbine tower sheared during a storm. I had been on the radio with him minutes before it happened. Since that day, safety stopped being a job description and became a promise I carried like a second spine. It shaped every protocol I wrote and every argument I fought with executives who preferred spreadsheets over lives. So standing there this morning, watching Chad Whitmore shuffle through documents he clearly didn't understand, reopened every old bruise. He grabbed a grid connection diagram and smiled like he'd discovered buried treasure. Except the blueprint he held was from 2014, a version so outdated it shouldn't even exist in the system anymore. Seeing it in his hands felt like watching someone play surgeon with a butter knife. They hadn't just replaced me. They had replaced caution with confidence. And that was the moment the betrayal finally settled in, not loud, not dramatic, but deep, the way a hairline crack silently weakens steel. 27 years of service, losses, storms, and midnight repairs had been traded for a resume with shiny lettering. I stood there, realizing the board didn't just overlook my experience. They erased it. They wanted efficiency without understanding the cost. They wanted modernization without memory. And while Chad proudly waved his outdated blueprint, I understood the truth. The grid would forgive their ignorance far sooner than I ever could. Some mistakes collapse silently, others echo for decades, and I felt everyone by the time the 3 black SUVs rolled through the front gate. The sun was barely above the turbine line. Their tinted windows reflected everything: our wind farm, the control building, and all the arrogance that had settled inside it overnight. The FERC-NERC joint audit team never arrived quietly, but today their presence felt surgical, like a team of federal coroners showing up to examine a body no one realized was dead yet. I watched from inside my truck. Engine off, coffee cooling untouched. Through the windshield, it all looked staged, a documentary scene where the narrator explains, in a low and somber voice, how rapidly a company can unravel when it mistakes confidence for competence. If anyone had walked past me, they might have thought I was calm. In reality, I was simply detached, cold enough to turn observation into a kind of entertainment. After all, I'd warned them for years what a real audit looked like. From my spot in the lot, I could see straight into the control room. Chad Whitmore hovered by the main console, flipping through notes like a student realizing the final exam wasn't open book after all. One of the inspectors asked him to explain frequency deviation thresholds. I couldn't hear the exact exchange, but I saw the telltale movements: Chad blinking, stalling, pretending to check something on his tablet. Anyone who knew the grid could read his body language like subtitles. He had no idea what they were talking about. In the corner office, CEO Mitchell Crane was already pacing. His mouth moved fast, his hands even faster, jabbing the air as he argued with the lead inspector. From here, it looked like he was negotiating the price of a used car instead of facing a federal reliability audit. The inspector didn't budge. He just crossed his arms and stared Mitchell down. The way a storm stares through a window before breaking it. I leaned back in my seat, letting the coldness settle in. The same cold that comes just before a turbine blade fractures. This wasn't my chaos anymore. They wanted modernization. They could modernize their way out of this. Then the moment arrived, the sharp pivot that cut through the room like a blade. The lead inspector stepped forward and spoke loudly enough that the entire floor froze. Bring me the man who calibrated the turbine alarms after the 2009 incident. Bring me Connor Hayes. Silence spread in a perfect wave. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even Chad lowered his useless tablet. And then, one by one, every face shifted toward the control room windows, toward the parking lot, toward me. I sat there in my truck, watching them finally remember the man they had replaced. The knock on my truck window didn't come gently. It came fast, sharp, and desperate, like someone tapping on glass right before it shatters. I lowered the window just enough to see a blur of hair, panic, and designer heels fighting for balance on the uneven pavement. It was Sarah, the CEO's assistant. Her bun had fallen apart, one earring was missing, and her right heel had clearly lost its will to live somewhere between the elevator and the parking lot. She stumbled again, catching herself on the side mirror before blurting out the words she was obviously sent to deliver. "Connor, please, the inspectors won't start until you return." Her breath came in short, uneven bursts. She wasn't out of shape, she was terrified, not of me, but of the audit team sitting upstairs waiting for the one person they trusted. I took a slow sip of my now cold coffee, letting the moment breathe the way a conductor holds silence before the first note. A younger version of me might have felt vindicated or furious, but 27 years in this industry teaches you a quieter kind of satisfaction, the kind that settles in your bones, not your voice. "So," I said finally, keeping my tone even, "Mitchell told me last month that I wasn't keeping up with the times, and now the times are calling me back." Sarah swallowed hard. "Connor, they won't begin without you. The lead inspector specifically asked for the person who calibrated the alarms in 2009. They refused to accept anyone else. I let that hang in the air like a turbine blade slowing to a stop. They wanted modernization. They wanted youth, Polish, and a Harvard crest. Instead, they got a stalled audit, a panicking boardroom, and a CEO pacing holes into the carpet. Mitchell's waiting upstairs, she added, voice cracking. He told me to bring you back at any cost. Any cost. That phrase has a certain flavor when spoken by a company that replaced you yesterday. I stepped out of the truck with deliberate calm. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just steady. The kind of steady that comes from knowing the truth has a longer lifespan than ego. As we approached the building, I could see faces pressed against the upper windows. Engineers, supervisors, even some of the new hires. The unspoken message was the same across all of them. We need you. And suddenly they do too. Inside. Mitchell Crane rushed toward me, his suit jacket unbuttoned, tie crooked, composure collapsing like faulty scaffolding. Connor. Thank God I raised a hand to stop him. Before we go upstairs, I said quietly, I have one question. He froze. Anything. I held his gaze with the same cold precision I used when inspecting turbine foundations. Mitchell, do you even know what CIP-0113 is? He blinked, eyes darting like someone searching for the exit in a burning room. Is that one of the voltage protocols? It wasn't anger that washed over me then. It was clarity, clean, sharp, undeniable. CIP-0013 was the federal cybersecurity standard every CEO in this industry should know. And he had no idea. Walking back into the building felt strangely familiar, like stepping into a room I'd lived in for decades, but had been locked out of for a single. Ridiculous day. Everything looked the same, the humming lights, the faint vibration of the HVAC, the low thrum of servers in the hallway. Yet the silence that greeted me was different, heavy, expectant, almost reverent. When I pushed open the door to the control center, every conversation stopped at once, one by one. The operators and engineers stood up not because anyone told them to, but because instinct pulled them to their feet. Some nodded, some pressed their lips together. Others simply watched me with the quiet relief people feel when the real pilot finally returns to the cockpit. The soundscape wrapped around me, the soft whir of the cooling fans, the steady clicking of relay indicators, and far in the distance, the deep rhythmic pulse of the turbines. It felt like the grid itself was exhaling, acknowledging that the person who understood its language had returned. And then there was Chad. He hovered near the main display panel, eyes darting across the screen like he was trying to decipher an alien dialect. His hand hovered over a setting he absolutely shouldn't touch. When he noticed me approaching, he straightened up too quickly, too forced and plastered on a smile that didn't even try to reach his eyes. Mr. Hayes, he said. I was just reviewing the harmonic deviation logs. The log was clearly labeled temperature drift metrics. I didn't correct him. My authority didn't need noise to exist. It lived in understanding, in history, in the kind of knowledge that doesn't announce itself. Instead, I moved past him, taking my place on the platform overlooking the control interface, the spot I had stood in for years, the spot that always gave me a full view of every vital signal. That was when the lead inspector approached. He held a clipboard, but his eyes weren't on the papers. They were fixed on the relay settings projected above the console. He tapped one value with the end of his pen. Who? He asked, his voice calm but precise. Set the protective relay threshold at 325 Hz deviation. This is perfect. The room shifted subtle, almost like an invisible wave. Every pair of eyes moved toward me. I didn't speak immediately. My silence had weight, and I let it settle before answering. I did, I said quietly. 14 years ago. The inspector nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd suspected. And the reasoning of memory flickered the storm, the radio static, my friend Michael's voice cutting in and out before the turbine tower gave way. That day taught me that the standard variance limits weren't good enough. Not for real storms, not for real people. To prevent a repeat of the 2009 incident, I replied, we needed a tighter threshold. The grid doesn't forgive wishful thinking. The inspector exhaled with conviction. Excellent work, Mr. Hayes. And standing there, no applause, no spotlight, just a simple acknowledgement grounded in truth. I felt my value settle back into place. Not loud, not dramatic, just real, silent authority. Restored. If anyone had told me yesterday that I'd be spending my afternoon giving the Harvard kid a crash course in real-world grid operations, I would have recommended they get their medication adjusted. But there we were, me walking ahead with the steady pace of someone who'd done this for decades, and Chad trailing behind like a tourist at an industrial museum he didn't ask to visit. Is this Normal vibration, he asked, leaning awkwardly toward a turbine tower as we approached the first platform. That I snorted softly. That's the turbine clearing its throat, if it were a problem. You'd feel it in your ribcage before you heard it. He blinked rapidly, as if waiting for a translation. I resisted the urge to pat him on the head. We moved past the turbine yard toward the inverters, those metal giants that convert raw, unpredictable wind power into something the grid can actually use. I showed him the heat signatures, the faint electrical smell that hinted at stress, the way a single spike on the harmonic graph could tell you more than 50 pages of theory. You can smell that, he asked, genuinely baffled. Burning insulation has a very distinct aroma, I said. Think grilled plastic with a side of regret. To his credit, he didn't laugh, just made a face like he'd swallowed a battery. Next, we stopped at the switching yard. High voltage lines crisscrossed overhead like steel nerves. Grids don't speak English, but they do communicate. You just need enough scar tissue to understand the warnings. Watch this, I told him, pointing to a minor oscillation on the frequency monitor. See that wobble? The line is complaining. No manual will tell you that. Chad stared at the screen with uncommon seriousness. For once, he wasn't pretending. We walked farther, eventually reaching the oldest turbine on the property, the one with a history carved into its steel. Its base still carried faint scars from the collapse that killed Michael Ortiz. I rested my hand on the tower, feeling its subtle vibration. The grid remembers everything. Kid, I said quietly, especially our mistakes. For the first time since he arrived, Chad fell completely silent. No clever comments, no performance, no Harvard shine. Just a young man realizing how much he didn't know. The wind whipped around us, rattling the guy wires like distant chimes. Maybe it was the cold, or maybe it was the weight of the moment. But he finally nodded. I didn't know. He murmured. No, I replied. You weren't supposed to, but now you do. We began walking back toward the control center when a voice called after me, low enough to be discreet, firm enough to matter. It was one of the inspectors. Connor, he whispered, stepping close. Without you, this entire grid would be one storm away from collapsing. His words weren't dramatic. They were factual. And sometimes, facts carry the deepest authority of all. After the inspectors finished their circuit of the facility, the building seemed to exhale relieved, unsettled, and slightly afraid of what came next. I didn't linger in the control room. Praise, panic, confusion, none of it mattered. There were bigger gears turning, and I needed space to think. So I walked down the hallway I'd traveled thousands of times before, past the old conference room, past the wall of outdated achievement plaques, until I reached the office that used to be mine. They hadn't bothered to change the nameplate yet. Typical. Inside, everything was exactly where I'd left it, except for the thin layer of dust that forms when a company decides to move forward without understanding what it's leaving behind. I crossed the room, knelt beside the bottom drawer of my old filing cabinet, and slid it open. Beneath a stack of technical binders sat a small steel USB drive, scuffed, heavy, and deliberately anonymous. No one ever asked why I kept an offline, metal-cased drive locked away. No one questioned why I updated it every few months. Maybe they assumed it held old reports or sentimental photos. They didn't realize it contained 7 years' worth of the kind of information that makes or breaks entire sectors. Inside were thousands of pages of data, real data, not the glossy, edited nonsense companies present to regulators, but the raw, unfiltered evidence of how 3 major competitors had been cutting corners for years, fabricated risk reports, phantom maintenance logs submitted with perfect timing but zero substance, manipulated load balance numbers that hid dangerous stress levels on their transmission lines, files that showed just how fragile and dishonest parts of the renewable energy sector had quietly become. I hadn't collected it for revenge. I'd collected it to keep the industry from collapsing under the weight of its own shortcuts. Renewable energy is only as strong as its weakest operator, and these companies were one structural failure away from taking down half a region with them. So, quietly, methodically, I reported my findings to federal contacts, always off the record, always clean, always exact, for years. No one at Northbridge knew, not because I was hiding it from them, but because they never once asked where my insights came from. They enjoyed the benefits without understanding the source. As I plugged the steel drive into the secure laptop still sitting in my old desk, A memory surfaced, one of the lead FERC investigators pulling me aside 2 years ago. He had lowered his voice, almost conspiratorial, and said, "Connor, off the record you see the things others pretend not to. We need eyes like yours." Back then, I didn't think much of it. Today, it meant something else entirely. Because yesterday, I had been the man they replaced without hesitation. But today, I was remembering the truth the board had never known. I wasn't just an employee. I was an unofficial technical advisor to the very federal team now dissecting our competitors. And suddenly, the quiet power of that fact filled the room more completely than any title ever could. Boardrooms have their own temperature, one that has nothing to do with the thermostat. It's a heat made of ego, fear, and the silent calculations happening behind every polished pair of glasses. When I walked into North Bridges, the temperature spiked instantly. Half the board stiffened in their chairs. The other half looked away, suddenly fascinated by the mahogany table. Only Mitchell Crane, the CEO who replaced me, looked directly at me, though his eyes carried the panic of a man waiting for a verdict he already knew wasn't good. I didn't sit. I didn't need to. I placed the steel USB on the table and watched the confusion ripple up the line of executives. "We're not here to talk about me," I began, my voice steady despite the pressure building inside my chest. "We're here because 3 of our largest competitors will be hit with federal penalties within the next 30 days. And when they fall, and they will, we either stand on the right side of this or we're dragged down with them." Silence. Then, slowly, I opened the folders I had brought. 7 years of evidence, meticulously gathered, verified, and cross-referenced. The projector hummed to life, casting graphs and photos across the wall, fabricated maintenance logs, manipulated load reports, safety violations buried under fake timestamps, patterns so blatant it was a miracle those companies still operated at all. The room froze. Not a single chair moved, not a throat cleared. Even the air vents seemed to hold their breath. "This," I said, tapping a chart showing falsified grid stress data, "is why their collapse is inevitable, and why we need to distance ourselves before the subpoenas start flying." My voice was calm, but inside, something simmered, a painful, restrained burn that came from years of warnings ignored, systems defended alone, and credibility questioned by people who never once set foot inside a turbine tower. I lifted my eyes to the board. The overhead lights reflected off the table, catching the edge of my face while Mitchell's forehead glistened with sweat. He dabbed it with a napkin, failing to hide his shaking hand. The contrast between us created a moment so cinematic it almost felt scripted. "And how?" one director asked quietly. "Do you know these penalties are coming?" I let the question hang. Then I answered, "Because FERC and NERC asked me to review these companies off the record. I've been consulting for them, unofficially." The reaction was immediate, a sharp collective inhale, the sound of pride cracking like ice under weight. Finally, one board member leaned forward, eyes wide with the kind of realization that arrives far too late. "So let me get this straight," he said, voice trembling. "We fired the man the federal government trusts most for a boy with a Harvard ring." No one argued, no one defended the decision. In that moment, their pride didn't break loudly. It broke completely. 3 weeks. That's all it took for the entire renewable energy sector, once loud, proud, and overconfident, to begin unraveling like a frayed cable under tension. The first blow came on a Monday morning, delivered in the form of a federal press release that landed with the force of a turbine blade hitting concrete. One of our biggest competitors was slapped with an operational suspension, falsified safety data, fraudulent maintenance logs, and unreported grid stress events. By Wednesday, the second company fell. News helicopters hovered above their wind farm as federal agents sealed off the switching yard with bright yellow tape. Trucks rolled in to uninstall turbines that had been quietly corroding from the inside. It looked like an industrial funeral cold, methodical, irreversible. And then, on Friday, before the week could take a breath, the third competitor collapsed under a mountain of fines so large it made headlines nationwide. Anchors on the evening news repeated phrases like systemic mismanagement, regulatory negligence, and catastrophic oversight failures. The kind of language that ends careers, reputations, and sometimes entire companies. Watching it unfold was surreal. I sat in my living room each night, the glow of the TV washing over me, feeling a strange mixture of sorrow and relief. Sorrow because the industry I'd given my life to was exposing its darkest flaws, Relief, because the truth, finally, undeniably, was being dragged into the light. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't triumph, it was cleansing, like the wind after a storm, stripping everything down to what's real. Meanwhile, Northbridge, barely holding itself together a month earlier, was suddenly the only operator with a spotless record. Customers, regulators, even investors began gravitating toward us like birds returning to the only branch left standing. And the irony, our newfound prestige wasn't because of anything new or shiny. It was because the system I'd designed 10 years ago, the one they had almost scrapped, still held strong, still balanced loads, still maintained frequency, still understood the wind the way I did. Inside the company, the mood shifted from panic to awe. Even Mitchell Crane avoided eye contact in the hallway, though he'd offer a stiff nod whenever we passed. Pride had a way of melding when faced with survival. But the true turning point came on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I'd just finished reviewing a vibration analysis report when Sarah knocked on my office door. She entered slowly, holding a thick envelope with a federal seal pressed into the corner. "This arrived for you," she said, sounding equal parts excited and breathless. When I opened it, the world slowed for a moment. Inside was a formal invitation from FERC, co-signed by NERC, requesting my appointment to the National Infrastructure Safety Advisory Council, a position so exclusive that even veteran CEOs rarely got near it. The letter described it as a strategic, long-term advisory role shaping the future of national energy reliability. For a few seconds, I didn't speak, not because I was shocked, but because something inside me finally exhaled. The kind of breath you release only after carrying the weight of an entire grid, an entire career, an entire loss for far too long, clearing, honest, liberating. My industry was breaking apart, and somehow my place within it had never been clearer. My promotion wasn't announced with fanfare, balloons, or some grand corporate speech. It arrived quietly, in a sealed envelope placed on my desk the morning after the industry collapse. Still, the title printed inside carried more weight than any applause ever could: Chief Infrastructure and Risk Officer, a position with authority equal to the CEO. When I walked into my new office for the first time, the room felt impossibly large: floor-to-ceiling windows, polished steel fixtures, and a sweeping view of the wind farm stretching across the horizon. The turbines turned slowly under the morning sun, blades cutting the air with steady confidence. I'd spent most of my life protecting those machines. Now I oversaw the entire infrastructure they powered. It was a victory. Yes, but not the loud kind. More like a quiet sunrise after a long storm. A soft knock pulled me from my thoughts. Chad stepped in, shoulders rounded, all traces of arrogance finally scraped off by reality. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, hands clasped, eyes on the floor like a student waiting to hear whether he'd passed or failed a class he barely understood. "Mr. Hayes," he murmured, I know I came in wrong. Thank you for not letting the grid suffer because of me." For once, he meant every word. I nodded. Not out of forgiveness, not yet, but because growth deserves acknowledgement, even if it arrives late. After he left, I opened the top drawer of my new desk and pulled out a small frame. The photo inside was of Michael Ortiz, my closest friend, the man who died on the turbine in 2009, the man whose memory carved half my career into purpose. I walked to the window and placed the photo on the sill so it looked out over the turbines, just as we had once done together. This wasn't just for me. "Mike," I said quietly. We made it. Later that afternoon, the executive team gathered the entire company in the atrium. Whispers filled the room as I stepped up to the podium, some voices relieved, others proud, all of them finally aware of what had almost been lost. I looked over the crowd, letting the moment settle before I spoke. "You didn't promote me," I said, voice steady, carrying. "Experience did. You all just arrived late to the meeting." The applause erupted instantly, thunderous, overwhelming, almost shaking the glass walls. For the first time in weeks, the company felt steady again, and as the noise rolled through the room, I realized the lesson I wish someone had told me years ago. Sometimes the road to justice is quiet, patient, and painfully slow, but when it arrives with absolute clarity. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to know where are you listening from, and if you enjoyed journeys of resilience, renewal, and well-earned redemption, feel free to like, share, comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. Sometimes one story can spark another, and yours might be next.